So there's a lot of opinions I have on the Nintendo Switch 2. Some positive, some not so much, but today's not about that. Nintendo is a company I've admired for over half my life for their creativity and leaps and risks they take that no other gaming company would, and over the decades have done so many unique and cool things for their hardware. And there's plenty of things you'd think would be a no-brainer that end up being pretty missed opportunities. Like for example in the Wii U and 3DS era having both GBA and DS games downloadable on the eShop for the Wii U only. And not the 3DS, which could already play both of those natively, huh? Or making games from every prior generation of Nintendo console downloadable on the Wii U eShop, but completely ignoring the GameCube, even though the Wii U can natively play GameCube games on its hardware and just never utilized it? Why? Anyway, today I'll be talking about things the Switch and Switch 2 should probably be able to do, but just don't. Missed opportunities on the Switch and Switch 2 Nintendo won't do. Menu themes. Nintendo consoles really got home menus right. The Wii, iconic. Wii U, it's just convenient, lovely design. The 3DS, this is my comfort place. The Switch? Well, this is boring. And Switch 2? You're messing with me, right? This is the same as the last one. But the 3DS though, partway into its lifespan, themes were introduced in an update, and things were never the same since. It started with simple color variations, but over time it rolled out so many more based on game series, characters, individual games. You could buy them individually, some were free, sometimes a code for one came with a product, or maybe Nintendo would just send you one in an email because they were feeling generous that day. Because Nintendo used to be like that. You can even shuffle your favorite themes and have a random one surprise you when you open it. Oh, sorry Sega Dreamcast, I thought this was the Nintendo 3D. Wait a minute! Folders, game icons, and the user interface with a scrolling background to match the theme, even with unique music and sound effects replacing the default. This even carried into the Switch era with the chill vibes of Breath of the Wild, and the high energy of Super Mario Odyssey. There was something really special about being able to customize your 3DS this way. Meanwhile on the Switch, it came default with two. Basic white and basic black. That's what we got in 2017, and we never got anything else to present day in 2025. Why? I mean, you went through the effort of making themes its own category and system settings, but come on, no blue and red? No pink and green? Both blue and red together for Mario? Or pink and green together for Splatoon 2? Where's the joy and fun, Nintendo? Not even a background tone, just complete silence. Switch 2 and the Game Boy camera. I'm sure some people have no intention of buying the Switch 2 camera for multiple reasons, but Nintendo sure want to push for it. And truthfully, it's not a bad idea. It plugs into the top of the Switch 2, it overlooks you from a distance for video chat and gimmicky related things, but the more I look at it, the more I question something so obvious they probably didn't even consider. When using handheld mode, why not make it so you can unplug the head of the camera from the stand and plug it directly into the top of the Switch 2? It's gone from an external camera to a portable webcam like what's built in on the 3DS and DSi. And even the licensed Piranha Plant camera, 480p by the way, does this exact same thing. And on top of that, does this idea remind you of something? It's basically become a modern Game Boy camera. Back in the days of the Game Boy, they released a cartridge with a camera sticking out the top, turning the Game Boy into one of the first and cheapest digital cameras. And this, without even trying, already looks like a reference to that. It's not just me, right? Anyway, moving on! Super Game Boy mode. Have you heard of the Super Game Boy? It's basically a Game Boy in the form of an SNES cartridge, and served as both the first way to play Game Boy games in color and the first way to play portable Nintendo games on a TV screen. Due to the small resolution of the Game Boy screen, the rest of the SNES resolution is filled with borders. Game Boy games are limited to a palette of 4 monochrome shades and can be swapped out with multiple preset color palettes, much like the Game Boy Color would a few years later. However, unlike Game Boy Color, the Super Game Boy could do something really special for original Game Boy games. This is Donkey Kong 94 in monochrome, this is Donkey Kong 94 on Game Boy Color, and this is Donkey Kong 94 on Super Game Boy. Games designed with the Super Game Boy in mind can have multiple palettes of 4 assigned to different sections of the screen, resulting in beautiful visuals intended for these games, and can even play sounds that the Game Boy can't using the SNES's sound chip. Also, the Game Boy version of Space Invaders straight up has a Super Nintendo ROM in it, and lots of games had their own unique borders included on the ROM, sometimes even multiple. Some Game Boy games were just the definitive versions through the Super Game Boy, and Nintendo just forgot about it and never acknowledged it again. On 3DS, Game Boy games that weren't designed to take advantage of the Game Boy Color were just permanently in monochrome, but that's when the Switch comes in. Game Boy and Game Boy Color games are playable via NSO, and what a treat! This is probably the most customizability retro Nintendo games I've ever had. Aside from playing Game Boy Color games, the regular Game Boy games can be played in 3 visual modes. the original Game Boy's classic yellowy green, the Game Boy Pocket's grayscale screen, and how the Game Boy games looked when being played on a Game Boy Color. Underneath, there's another option called Reproduce Classic Feel, which adds a filter dividing the screen into individual pixels. It's not entirely accurate to what the Game Boy screens looked like, but it's still pretty cool, and even adds a small amount of motion blur that was originally visible on the original Game Boy screen. That's such an insignificant detail they didn't have to add, but that's just so cool. And then there's one more option, display with small screen size. Oh, right, I was forgetting something. They just neglected Super Game Boy. Every option you could want was here, except Super Game Boy. I could probably have ignored that except two things. One, why would they add this in? There's all this negative space that just happens to be almost exactly the correct size for the borders that were designed to fill the space around Game Boy games. Am I not going crazy for thinking this? Even the 3DS had a small screen mode, and it had custom borders too instead of blank negative space. And the other thing is Donkey Kong 94 is here. Look at this! Am I supposed to just accept this, knowing full well what it could look like? And the lack of borders are borderline missed opportunity. But you never know what to expect with Nintendo, as after writing the script, they dropped Mario Paint for the Super Nintendo app that utilizes the Switch 2's mouse mode. But instead of neglecting the original Switch, they updated the app to be compatible with any USB mouse, either wired or wireless, connected to the dock or with a USB-C adapter. I guess what I'm saying is, they're not opposed to adding new features and updates. GBA support. I think one of the biggest things people were excited by was the announcement of GameCube games being available for subscribers of the Switch Online service, which is amazing because for whatever reason GameCube games rarely ever get re-releases, with most examples being the new Control Wii ports or full-on remasters or remakes. To this day, I have never even played Luigi's Mansion. GameCube games aren't exactly easy to come by nor cheap. And alongside the USB adapters for GameCube controllers still being supported, they've also released new modern GameCube controllers to go with the previous NSO controllers. Wow, say that 3 times fast. Many GameCube games utilize compatibility with the GameCube's portable counterpart, the Game Boy Advance. There's a cable that connects to the link cable port on the back of the GBA, and the other end into the controller port of the GameCube. Certain GBA and GameCube games can communicate and transfer data with each other, like trading between the console and handheld Pokémon games, or sending a Chao from Sonic Adventure DX or Sonic Adventure 2 Battle's Chao Garden to the Tiny Chao Garden in games like Sonic Advance and vice versa to either take them on the go or bring them to a friend's place. The GBA can also temporarily download software to its internal RAM when no game is inserted, so if you didn't have one of the games that included it, you could download the Tiny Chao Garden on its own directly to the GBA through Sonic Adventure or Sonic Adventure 2, and will remain there until turned off or the battery runs out. This also lets you get a special Chao from another Sega game called Phantasy Star Online or a Japanese demo disc to bring back to Sonic Adventure or Sonic Adventure 2. This multi-boot functionality was also used to load mini-games from either a GameCube game or e-reader cards, the latter of which could also load NES games. But its more iconic uses are when the GBA is used as an extension of the GameCube itself, like a second screen. Four Swords Adventures is a game made for 4 players, each with their own GBA as a controller, and if a player went off screen or into a cave or a house, they'd appear on the GBA screen. Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is currently on NSO for Switch 2, and the game features an item called the Tingle Tuner. Normally to use this item, you need a GBA turned on and plugged into your GameCube, or in my case Wii, and using the Tingle Tuner summons Tingle to your location. A map screen appears on the GBA, and using it you can control Tingle, who can drop bombs on an enemy, you can buy items from him, or you can hover over points of interest and Tingle will talk to you about things or find secrets. So when you use the Tingle Tuner on Switch 2, nothing happens, because there is no GBA plugged in. The Switch 2 is not designed to connect to a GBA. All GBA features in GameCube games for Switch 2 will just be unusable. I can think of several workarounds off the top of my head. We have the NSO app for smartphones, which has different uses depending on the game associated. And the recent Switch 2 editions of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are able to communicate to the app and show your in-game location on the map in real time. So what if the NSO app had a section for GameCube games that makes a Game Boy Advance interface on your phone, where when you do something in-game that connects to a GBA, the app immediately recognizes it and the Switch streams the multi-boot data to the app. It could be presented as a GBA screen with some touch buttons, perhaps styled like a GBA SP in portrait mode or the original GBA in landscape. In theory, I can see this easily working. Another option would be to just use a second Switch. Now, nobody should be expected to buy a console and then need another for something like this, but there's a very high chance the majority of Switch 2 owners already own an original Switch or Switch Lite. And even if they don't, it's still likely they have a friend or sibling who has their own Switch or Switch 2, so why not make it that wirelessly connecting a second system lets you use it as an equivalent to a plugged-in GBA. In fact, unlike the smartphone idea, you wouldn't be limited to just the multi-boots because both Switch and Switch 2 already have GBA games? Already has GBA games through NSO, so in theory, they could add the ability to connect in an update. But if there's a way I personally want to do it, I just want to grab a real GBA and plug it in directly. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if you already had a GBA and you wanted to use it with a GameCube game that's on the Switch too? You can already plug real GameCube controllers into your Switch or Switch 2 with the GameCube USB adapter, so why not just plug the thing in and use it? In truth, this isn't an unprecedented concept. I mean, outside of Nintendo, the PlayStation 3 could natively play PS1 games and even had a USB adapter, which is basically impossible to get these days, that let you use real PS1 and PS2 memory cards and transfer saves between them and the console. Gosh, could you imagine loading your original GameCube saves onto the Switch 2? I think memory cards with SD slots were a thing. Then you can just copy your files onto your Switch's microSD, and I'm getting ahead of myself. The Game Boy Advance is over 20 years old. How many people buying a Switch 2 in 2025 will just happen to already have one? And even so, the adapters for GameCube controllers can only read button inputs, not transfer data. It would be cool if they made a new revision that could, but I don't see that happening. But I do know something the current adapter can do. Yes, you are seeing what you're seeing. No mods, I am controlling my Switch using a Game Boy Advance. And only official hardware. How, you may ask? Well, I learned about it from this video by Roller. Turns out, when you turn on a Game Boy Advance while plugged into the GameCube's Game Boy player, it boots the GBA into a controller mode so your GBA can be used as a controller to play your GBA games on the TV screen. But when it's unplugged, the GBA remains in controller mode, meaning it's basically a GameCube controller now, so what happens if there's no need for dramatic build-up, it just works. The button inputs on the GBA is going through the link cable to the GameCube adapter, which is plugged into the Switch dock, and as far as your Switch is concerned, it's a USB Pro controller. And of course, with Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games on Switch and Switch 2, you can just play them using a real GBA. That alone would be awesome if you could do it natively without this complicated setup. If you don't own a GameCube or Game Boy player, there are some unofficial ways to get this going, as I found falling down this rabbit hole. If you own a GBA flash card, you can load the multi-boot files by microSD card, but if you want to get real crazy with it, just use a Wii. No, I'm not joking. If you have a Wii with homebrew software loaded onto it, there is an app that can read files off your Wii's SD card and sends them to your GBA through its GameCube link cable, which has been really fun to mess with. I found the multi-boot files for the Game Boy player online but couldn't get them to work, but there is another custom program you can boot made by Extrem's Corner that has some specific profiles. My GBA screen says Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. But I also found the enhanced Wii port of the popular GBA emulator, MGBA, automatically boots a GBA into Game Boy player mode, so that's what I've been doing. Oh, what could have been. Pokémon. You thought you escaped me saying the word Game Boy again, but between the NSO apps for Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, you notice anything missing? Probably the most popular and beloved games of those platforms. Where on earth are the Pokémon games at? The IP isn't entirely missing. Spin-offs Pokémon the Trading Card Game, Mystery Dungeon, under N64 there's Pokémon Snap, Pokémon Stadium 2, oh and we can't forget Pokémon Puzzle League, not to mention we have GameCube games Pokémon Coliseum and XD Gale of Darkness coming to Switch 2 soon. So where on earth are the actual main series games? Red, Blue, Yellow, possibly Green as a Japanese exclusive, Gold, Silver, Crystal, Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, Leaf Green, where are they? It feels like the most obvious inclusion, yet such a clearly intentional decision. I'm not exaggerating when I say the most popular and highest selling of their respective platforms. And we can just slide Tetris in there between Gen 1 and 2, but it was bundled with the system. It is beyond me why Nintendo and the Pokémon Company have such a thing against re-releasing these older Pokémon games. I mean, have you seen how much people resell the original carts for? As far as I can tell, this has only happened once in a blue moon where they dropped Gen 1 and later Gen 2 on the 3DS, and you can't even buy them on that anymore because the 3DS eShop was closed. I don't know if there's some strategic business decision behind this my feeble customer mind can't comprehend, but it's honestly just silly. It would certainly pull a lot more people buying subscriptions to Switch Online and its expansion pass. Pokemon you catch could probably be transferred to Pokemon Home and by extension all the existing Switch Pokemon games. Plus, Pokemon Home is already designed to recognize Mons transferred from the Game Boy games via 3DS. A lot of people want to see a collection of these games in one package, but I don't see that happening. Maybe a dedicated version of the Game Boy app, like the mature version of the N64 app. Maybe they'd release things on the eShop directly, if even at all. Maybe that's preferable to paying a subscription. Who knows, really? The Pokemon Company is difficult to predict at times, and sometimes a little too predictable. And on top of that, They added Pokémon Stadium 1 and 2 to the N64 games. Do you know what the point of these games are? They exist as extensions of the Game Boy games. Here's the original game, technically not the original because the Japanese version was the sequel to the bare-bones unfinished version that only released in Japan. The game uses the N64 transfer pack that you plug your Game Boy cartridges into. The game itself revolves around battles, but is also basically a hub for managing your Game Boy save. Most of the features in this game are unusable without plugging in red, blue, or yellow. Otherwise, you can only use rental Pokemon you can't customize. Also, you can play the Game Boy games directly within Pokémon Stadium. And unlike connecting a GBA game to a GameCube, you don't need a separate device. The N64 game reads the data directly off the Game Boy cartridge plugged into its controller as if it were a memory pack. Where does the Switch save data for N64 memory packs? On the Switch! Where does the Switch save data for Game Boy save files? Also on the Switch! So in theory, if you have both NSO apps for Game Boy and N64, and you have created save files for red, blue, or yellow, then opening Pokémon Stadium should be given the option to choose between one of those saves, and when the game starts, it acts as if a transfer pack with the games are plugged in. And adding to that, if you went online to play multiplayer with your friends, you can battle each other using your own Pokemon you caught and trained in red and blue and yellow, because that was the whole point of Pokémon Stadium! I'm done. Goodbye! Switch VR. During the VR craze, Nintendo released the Labo VR set, basically their own Google Cardboard for Switch, except it cost like $80 or more, for a box of cardboard and some plastic pieces. Aren't I glad I found this secondhand for like $15 and no game in the box? Beyond the Labo VR software, Nintendo only ever utilized VR again in a small handful of existing games through updates such as Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, Captain Toad, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as side modes. They don't really add anything and are just a showcase of being able to look around in VR. And then, nothing ever again for several years. I guess, like many people, Nintendo got bored of VR and forgot about it. I actually started thinking about this months ago when I walked into an EB Games and saw a third-party Switch headset, which I didn't expect nor had ever heard of. Turns out quite a few third-party headsets for Switch exist, even though there's almost nothing to use them with. That is until I did research for this video and learned there were a handful of indie games ported to Switch that were also available on Oculus Quest, Steam VR, and PSVR. That all utilized the Labo VR headset on Switch, which I didn't expect anyone to do, especially since Five Nights at Freddy's VR Help Wanted was ported to Switch and doesn't even use VR at all, which is kind of hilarious. I think there's a lot of missed potential for this, knowing how creative Nintendo can be with experimental stuff and how fun a dedicated VR experience for Nintendo properties possibly could be, but nope, they just abandoned the concept. And while I just assumed the Joy-Cons had to be attached to hold it at all times because they have the gyroscope in them, turns out the console itself has a gyroscope and can be used in VR mode without the Joy-Cons, meaning if it was strapped to your head, you could just hold the Joy-Cons like a Wiimote and nunchuck and use them to swing a sword, point a blaster, but I guess nobody at Nintendo ever considered this. They haven't actually sold the Labo VR for a good few years now. I don't see them doing this for the Switch 2 because, my gosh, have you seen the size of this thing? I already thought the original Switch was a little oversized to be placed on your face. However, not long ago they announced Virtual Boy games for the Switch Online Classics accompanied by a full-sized replica of the original Virtual Boy you can insert your Switch or Switch 2 into, which honestly is the coolest thing ever given how it's almost impossible to own an original Virtual Boy because it's, well, wasn't very good and nobody wanted it. And this is a pretty awesome way to experience that, or even just for collecting reasons, although it doesn't include the controller. Way to be consistent with controllers for everything else and not this. And if you think it costs too much because it's 2020's Nintendo, of course it will. They have a cheap alternative in a cardboard version. Hey, talk about a comeback for Labo VR, as silly as the whole thing is. I know a lot of people think this is pointless and asked who wants to play Virtual Boy games. Me, I do! Hold on, what's that now? Required. What do you mean required? No elaboration. What happens if you try to play without the replica? Does the system just not let you play? Or does it exclusively play in stereoscopic, giving you double vision? There's no way you can't just, I don't know, press a button and make it a single display. How on earth would you play it in docked mode? I don't know, man. Nintendo is just something real different at the moment. Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. I'm noticing a pattern here of Nintendo dropping a really clever creative concept involving a sold separately accessory, except when it's released it's incredibly overpriced, which draws people away from it, and then they abandon it a year or two later, making it unavailable to find anywhere. Seriously, both this and Labo sets are still listed on Nintendo's website as if they're still current products, and then I just happened to find it secondhand in an incomplete state later. Nintendo combined Mario Kart gameplay with RC race cars. How could anybody not think that's the coolest thing ever? The game itself is a free download and what you buy in stores is the kart. And once again, a bunch of cardboard. The only characters released were Mario and Luigi, and on the Switch it plays very closely to Mario Kart 8. And Mario even reacts accordingly when the kart bumps into something in real life. Even without the bits of cardboard to make a virtual track with, I had fun for hours just driving the thing around the house. Mamma mia. And I could have seen this becoming a much bigger thing if they had more characters and maybe more packs that you could make tracks with. Heck, imagine if places hosted events with custom-built tracks. Multiple people could come in and race competitively, except the entry price for this was asking far too much, both for the cost of the carts alone, as well as not everyone having an available indoor space to drive or the creative investment to set up or make tracks. The whole thing was just a one and done, and an incredibly missed opportunity to be something far greater. Amiibo, what even happened? They were thriving in the Wii U and 3DS era with so many different ideas and uses. By 2021, they were becoming incredibly hard to find as stores were no longer stocking older ones, and the new ones came in such limited supply, so there was a good chance you weren't getting them at all without pre-ordering them. Thankfully, that's a thing of the past now, as Nintendo have learned from this and have been reprinting and restocking Amiibo, making them more available than ever. You can even order them from their main store. So Nintendo now understand how popular Amiibo are for collecting and are releasing them alongside relevant games, but things are starting to get questionable as they continue to get larger with more detail, meaning they're getting more expensive. They just announced Mario and Rosalina Amiibo for the new Mario Galaxy remasters, but look at the asking price for the Amiibo and the game. You know what's a real missed opportunity? Bundles. With so many Amiibo dedicated to specific games, it's surprising there's no Switch games that had an edition boxed with an Amiibo, which they haven't done since the Wii U or 3DS era for whatever reason. But what's probably a bigger missed opportunity than that is the functionality of said Amiibo. Collecting them is cool, but their main purpose is to see what they can do in-game. From a simple scan for a random item to saving data to a figure, or even using it to transfer data from one game to another, unlocking cosmetics and skins based on that Amiibo, a fun optional extra if you happen to have it. Heck, this was one of my favorite things about Super Mario Maker. Tap Sonic and look! I'm playing as Sonic! But Mario Maker 2 on the Switch just ditched this entirely. There's an in-game item for playing as Link, but that's it. There are these two free games specifically designed around Amiibo. Mini Mario and Friends use Amiibo as playable characters, and Amiibo Touch and Play lets you tap the Amiibo to sample different sections of a random NES or SNES game. We also learned through Samus Returns that an Amiibo should never be used as a paywall to lock a game mode or function behind, and the Switch era overall has done the minimum with Amiibo, mostly just tap to use an item and not much else. Which includes the big $50 Mario Galaxy Amiibo, here's a Life Shroom, here's a 1-Up Mushroom, and Skyward Sword HD that Denono unlocks a new fast travel feature behind the Zelda Loftwing Amiibo. So overall, just afterthoughts. I'm glad to see Amiibo in stores again, but there's very little incentive for them now. Hey, editor's note, it's a few months later, and we now know what the Metroid Prime 4 Amiibo do. They, unlock exclusive story content. Yeah, so pretty much nobody ever learns their lessons! HD Rumble. Rumble has been a standard in gaming for years now and has come a long way from a bulky pack with a motor and 2 AAA batteries in it. I remember seeing the showcase for the HD Rumble in the Joy-Cons, and it was showcased by visualizing a glass with an ice cube in it to show what holding the Joy-Con felt like in that moment. And then 2, and then 3 ice cubes shaking in a glass, and then the feeling of holding a glass getting filled by water. Okay, it's not the easiest thing to describe verbally, but that's still a pretty impressive display of versatile haptic feedback unlike any we've seen in a controller before. I remember playing Super Mario Odyssey for the first time and jumping onto the Vespa, and feeling the subtle vibrations as if I were holding onto the handlebars and being surprised by how cool that detail felt. HD Rumble is also capable of making many different beeps and sounds. And some software took advantage to play tones and tunes on it, and some people just went wild figuring out ways to play songs with it. However, there is always a catch with any new innovative or immersive features on new systems and controllers that are advertised to the moon and back as a selling point. Eventually, everyone just stops caring and forgets it exists. Remember the PS5's adaptive triggers? How many of you watching just now thought, oh right, PS5 has adaptive triggers, they made a big deal of that. So while there's a sizable chunk of games that utilize the Switch's HD Rumble in many unique ways, it started to disappear altogether the more years passed into the Switch's lifespan, but not entirely forgotten, as every now and then devs still find uses for it. And the Switch 2 Joy-Cons feature an improved version and is able to play sounds in a much higher quality, and it doesn't even have a built-in speaker. IR sensor. Are we doing this? Are we really doing this? Oh man, to finish this we are talking about the most silly thing on this list. All Nintendo Switches have an IR sensor underneath the right Joy-Con, much like the one used on the top of the Wiimote to point at the TV screen. Coincidentally, the right Joy-Con is also always used to mimic the Wii pointer in ports of Wii games using the built-in gyro, which doesn't really work that well. And they never give you the option in these games to use the left Joy-Con, which for me, a left-hander, would have just felt more natural, but we're getting off topic. The Joy-Con's IR sensor is significantly more advanced than the Wii's, being a higher resolution and can detect both depth and motion, which allows it to recognize different shapes and objects. And when the feature was introduced, it was showcased by recognizing rock, paper, scissors. Also, it's capable of measuring your pulse and heartbeat from your finger. What? So many capabilities, you'd imagine the creative possibilities are endless, so what did they use it for? Pretending to eat a burger, and that's all anyone really remembers. The list of games that use it is incredibly short, and most of them aren't even from Nintendo's themselves beyond 1-2 Switch and the Labo kits. Resident Evil Revelations allows you to reload by making a reloading action with the Joy-Cons. That's pretty cool. Ninja, oh I remember that one, people thought it was similar to Splatoon. Lets you scan its trading cards. I didn't know about that. But then there's the shovelware titles that probably just used it to test the feature out. And then there's Night Vision, which for almost $14 lets you see stuff in the dark, just very, very poorly. Nintendo cared so little about using the IR sensor that the Switch 2's Joy-Con doesn't even have it. Or so you'd think, because even though the main IR sensor has been removed, 2 small ones are now used on the sides for the mouse mode, and probably has yet to be seen features. It's a step down, but at least they're getting some use out of it. I think I'll end the video here. Thank you so much for watching. I've been trying to get this video out for like forever. I was writing this at the same time as the movie Supersonic video. Yeah, that long. There's actually many parts of the video I had to rewrite and change whenever something new would happen. I originally recorded the Game Boy Donkey Kong footage on an emulator because I didn't have an original cartridge, and then I got a cartridge and it's like, well, I guess I'm re-recording this. Also, yes, I'm completely aware of how terrible my timing is with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, but I'm just glad they're available for new people to try. Stay tuned, and stay awesome. Bye!